The history of childcare in the United States is a reflection of our nation's changing economy, America's times of crisis, and her citizens' sense of a woman's place. Among Native American nomadic tribes and early farmers, children were cared for by the extended family. For early European immigrant groups, it was the same. Farm children were expected to help with the harvest. Large families were the norm. The harnessing of steam power and the chugging machines of the new industrial age, combined with waves of poor immigrants and emancipated Southern slaves, fueled great economic change in the young nation. America's first factory workers were children. Industry treated them like miniature adults. Their tiny hands were able to run the spindles and looms of early machines. Their small bodies fit the cramped shafts of coal mines, and thousands of shoeless urchins worked long hours in unsafe conditions, just as they do today in other parts of the world. It was a dramatic shift from the hard but healthier childhood on the American farm. The new economy was diluting the traditional extended family. As the agrarian age ended, rural people and immigrants flooded into the teeming industrial cities. Close relatives were left behind. Fathers now toiled away from home. Mothers whose husbands were killed or permanently injured by the dangerous work of the day, or who fled an abusive spouse, were often left penniless, with no option but to work outside the home for food. They had no choice but to leave their children with others, or even alone. Public attitudes had a profound effect on the early days of childcare. Despite the cruel realities for poor working mothers, American society held firmly to the cult of true womanhood, the notion that a woman's place was in the home. Wealthier urban white women seldom worked, and if they did, they could afford to hire nannies. Mothers on the farm were still at home. Less than one American family in 20 had a mother working away from home. Most often, poor urban white mothers and women of color. They often faced desperate choices. Some of the earliest child care efforts were spawned near the turn of the century by urban social service agencies for the poor. In New York, day nurseries were created to care for infants of women of all colors who toiled in low-wage garment factories. And the typical large family of the day meant many older sisters were called on to take care of young siblings. There were so many that training programs for little mothers were instituted. But these were isolated efforts that did little to help hundreds of thousands of children of the poor. There was little demand for government to address these issues. It would be decades before these citizens even had the right to vote, and before women began to bring what had been considered private issues into the public sphere. Only in times of national crisis did the government's attitude change. When the economy collapsed in the 1930s, so many nurses and teachers were out of work that the government launched a large program creating centers for children of the poor. Ironically, they helped care for the children of thousands of mothers forced to take menial work when their own husbands lost the family wage job that used to support them all. For very young children, this Depression-era effort focused primarily on their health and nutrition, but there was an educational component for older children as well. During wartime, the need for women to replace men in factories forced government to provide support for working mothers. But again, these efforts dealt first with getting the mother into the workforce, an economic consideration, not with the importance of early care and stimulation for the preschool children who entered these programs. Washington State's history mirrored the rest of the nation. During World War II, thousands of women workers in aircraft factories and shipyards could count on quality, subsidized child care nearby. But after the conflict ended and men started to return to the factory, these child care facilities were closed. It would be decades before the government looked seriously at the issue again, in spite of the steady stream of women moving into the American workforce. In 1940, before the start of the war, only one family in 10 had a mother working outside the home. That number grew rapidly during the 40s. By 1950, it was one family in 6. But despite these statistics, public perception was still that good mothers didn't work. In the new age of television, women could increasingly be seen working on the factory floor. But television programs like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best and other media perpetuated the image of the stay-at-home mom as the norm. In the early 60s, another war brought government back to the issue of childcare. This time, the War on Poverty created the Head Start program. Again, it dealt with childcare as an issue of impoverished families. But unlike previous efforts, it had a significant educational component as well. Slowly, the idea was taking hold that early childhood education could be beneficial. By the mid-60s, almost one Washington family in 3 had a working mother. But professional childcare was hard to find or non-existent for those working mothers without nearby family or friends to call on. And sadly, those few facilities that were in business were often woefully unprepared to provide quality or even safe care. Child care was still below the radar of most leaders and politicians. This changed dramatically in the winter of 1966, when a daytime fire in a Seattle daycare killed 3 children and critically injured 4 others. The heartbreaking newspaper photos and the fact that the home was unsafe and unlicensed led to a public outcry for stronger enforcement of state regulation of family child care homes. By 1967, the state's licensing laws started to have teeth. What the media attention brought to light was the relentless flow of mothers entering the workforce. The rising employment rate of middle-class white women was especially significant in increasing visibility of the issue. This would have far-reaching implications in the decades ahead. The 70s saw continued growth of working women and the biggest defeat for childcare in the nation's capital. A far-reaching childcare bill calling for federal funds for a wide range of programs beyond simply helping the poor was vetoed by President Richard Nixon. When conservative opponents of the program claimed that federal involvement in childcare was a government intrusion on the American family and smacked of communism, the bill died a quick death. The 1980s were especially significant in Washington state. For the first time, research showed that the majority of mothers with young children were in the workforce. The steady stream had now become a river of women entering the labor market. In 1986, a special task force was named by the new governor, Booth Gardner, to examine the issue of child care and make recommendations for state action. In the 90s, as the ranks of working women continued to swell, federal funds also began to increase for child care. For the first time, significant monies began to go for improved training and support services, such as child care resource and referral agencies to link parents with providers. A swelling percentage of working women included not just those working outside the home, but increasingly mothers with young children deciding to make a career of home-based child care. The tide was turning. By the final years of the 20th century, the sheer numbers of working mothers, many of them in positions of power, brought political clout to a long-ignored public policy question. And on a parallel path, startling new brain research proved conclusively that the first 5 years of life were much more significant in terms of intelligence and personality development than ever thought possible. These 2 factors, raw political power and scientific proof that young children can and do learn from stimulation from the earliest age, combined to set the tone for much greater public support for child care in the Evergreen State, support that should continue to grow well into this new century. In a little more than 100 years, America has changed from being a developing nation that exploited the labor of its youth, literally robbing them of their childhood. Today, we see our children as a precious resource, and we understand the magical time of growth and memories childhood represents. We've come a long way in the care of our youngest citizens. Today, in families with children under 6 years of age, a stunning 2 out of 3 mothers now work outside the home. Today, the concept of quality child care as a safe and stimulating service available to rich and poor throughout society is increasingly expected and demanded. Access to this care is now a vital factor in our nation's economy. The heart of worthy child care is the quality of the adults who practice this craft. The growth of professional training opportunities and increased support for these thousands of home-based operators is laying the foundation for a new era of child care.